Haluaya, a 54-year-old lady, lived in the coastal town of Malindi, Kenya. Her husband of 10 years left her to go be with another woman, and she was forced to raise their 6 children all on her own. Being very resilient, Halua opened up a cafe. Then she bought a farm where she built her home, and she was able to send her 6 children to school. And even when her teen daughter gave birth, she took on the responsibility of raising her grandchild. When Halua's grandchild turned 8, she started suffering from a mysterious disease. She suffered from severe stomach pains and she threw up every time she ate food. So Halua takes her 8-year-old grandchild to hospital, and as the doctors tried to help her, nothing seemed to work. Halua had heard of a pastor called Paul Mackenzie who had the ability to heal the sick. So curious, she decided to go to one of his crusades. He said that if Mackenzie can talk to Jesus and he's able to perform all these miracles, then surely he'll be able to talk to Jesus to take away the disease that was plaguing her grandchild. Mackenzie's sermons impressed her very much. The promise of eternal bliss for believers during the apocalypse had this calming effect on Halua, who said that she was not afraid of the end of the world. And then she also witnessed some of Mackenzie's miracles. At one point, he prayed over a girl who had a seizure, and the seizure seemed to stop. And also, in another occasion, Mackenzie prayed over a man who had this deep infected wound, and it seemed to heal after a week. She was into all the miracles. This is exactly what she needed at this time, and she started attending the church. So Halua became very devoted to the church. And when Halua heard that Mackenzie was starting a whole new community in a place called Shakahola, and she decided to move there with her granddaughter. She sold her goat for 5,000 shillings and she went. She was very excited. She says that she lived in a village called Jericho. So in Shakahola, the Paul Mackenzie, he had divided the 800-acre piece of land into villages and he named them after biblical names, and she lived in Jericho. She says that the pastor would hold very lengthy prayer sessions and nothing much happened in the community apart from praying. And then at some point, Mackenzie started talking about fasting, and he said that fasting would bring them closer to Christ. So at first, Halua really tried her best to obey, but when the hunger became too much for them, she would sneak out and she would go buy some milk, she would buy some biscuits, she would buy some bread for her and her granddaughter. She said she did this in secret, so that no one else would know this was happening. And the prayers at first, they did seem like it was working because her granddaughter started drinking porridge and she even started to gain some weight. So, she was very happy that she decided to take this risk and it seemed to be paying off. Her granddaughter was doing better. So after a month of Shakahola, she left and she went back to Malindi. However, in 2022, Halua was diagnosed with vaginal fistula and she was very ashamed and she was in pain. And this is when she decided to go back to Shakahola. This time, she did not come back with her granddaughter. Instead, she came back with 2 of her friends. One of them is called Halifu. She is a 35-year-old lady who sold fruits and vegetables. And the other lady was called Remy. She was 27 years old. So Halifu, one of her friends, that 5-year-old lady, was suffering from depression because sadly her husband had died from a stroke. And the 27-year-old friend called Remy, she had grown up very poor and she suffered from chronic chest pain. So they all decided to come with Halua to Shakahola. When they got to Shakahola, Halua noticed that the community had changed very much. There was a huge difference from when she had left the village. The fasting had become more severe. At first, they received 2 slices of bread and a cup of tea every day, but then after 3 weeks, the women were told that there would be no more food. They were told it was time. It was time for them to starve themselves in order to meet Jesus in heaven. Alua was very afraid. She was scared. This was not the community she left. She recalls there were people who would patrol the village and they were armed with knives and machetes to prevent people from leaving the village. So the children were fast to starve to death. Then the women, then the men. Mackenzie used to tell them that whether you want to or not, there is no one who is going home. You are all going to be buried here. Meaning no one would be allowed to leave. This would be their resting place. The three women were trapped. They were trapped and they mostly survived by going to the forest and finding some wild fruits. Those who refused to fast would be dragged out by security. They would be beaten, strangled, and attacked. Ia recalls seeing a woman and her child killed as they tried to escape. She also remember a woman in the village was giving birth, and Halua and her two friends decided to help the woman give birth. The woman needed to seek medical attention because she had some complications during childbirth, and of course the security told her no, you cannot leave to go seek medical attention. So at some point the security came and tried to take away her baby, and the woman refused. She said, "You're not going to go with my baby," and the baby was hit in the head by a hammer, and the baby died. And then they killed the mother afterwards. It was hell. Leah recalls they couldn't stop crying. They were crying at night every time. They were just so saddened. They were trapped and all they could do was cry. Mid 2022, Remy, one of Halua's friends, was attacked. Four security men came to her hut. They took her and they raped her in the bushes. After they assaulted her, this is when they decided it's time. We have to escape. We can't continue living like this. And they started to study the patrol routes that the security guards and Mackenzie would take. Remy recalls that when they were leaving, all she remembers is seeing these confused people. People were hungry. They were so confused. They were so defeated. She saw people just in a daze. She saw some people so confused that all they could do was cry. And they left. They managed to escape. They traveled at night and they slept under the trees during the day. They would eat berries and fruits from the forest, and they would drink water from the streams. And they knew the forest very well. They knew that if they traveled west, the forest became more dense and it would be easy for them to avoid being detected. It took the women, 4 days to find a road where they were able to stop a car that was passing by, and the car took them to a nearby village. It was when they got to the village when they broke down. They started crying, and the people from the village, they did give the women something to eat and something to drink, and they were taken back to Malindi by the Malindi Community Human Rights Center. When they got there, they didn't really talk about the fasting and the kidnappings because they say they were afraid that they would be tracked down and killed. So I'm sure you're probably wondering who Paul Mackenzie is, how he got started, what is Shakahola, and what is going on.
Controversial preacher Paul Mackenzie and 29 others have been charged with 191 counts of murder.
Survivors of the sect have narrated horrifying tales of how they were introduced to the cult, giving up everything they had.
My name is Naomi Nyendo, and let's get into it. Paul Mackenzie. So he was born in 1973. He's the fifth born in a family of 10. And he had a pretty basic, pretty normal childhood. His brother says that Paul did not really stand out. You know, there are those children who stand out in a crowd. Paul was not one of them. It is said, however, that Paul did have a bit of a violent streak. He did have a bit of a temper. And his brother, he's called Robert, he recalls that at one point when Paul was 16, he was playing hide and seek and he started beating another boy very violently. He says that when you get Paul mad, he can really hurt you, he can really beat you. After secondary school, Paul made money doing all sorts of jobs, odd jobs. He would hawk, he started hawking, he would sell flour, he would push a cart. And it was his sister Kadogo, she's dead now, who decided to take Paul to get some driving lessons, and she also bought him a car so that he could start his taxi business. While he was conducting his taxi business in Malindi, this was when he started attending church services and he developed a passion for preaching. And he says that this was his calling. So when he started off, he would preach in different churches. Other churches would invite him over and he would preach. Then he would go to another church, preach there. And he actually made a name for himself. He started gaining some recognition in the area due to the sermons he gave in other churches. So in 2003, this is when he founded his own church. It's called the Good News International, and it became very popular. He had over 3,000 followers. He even opened up branches in other locations, in other counties. And the church's aim was to nurture the faithful holistically in all matters of Christian spirituality as we prepare for the second coming of Jesus Christ through teaching and evangelism. And initially, things were okay. His church, he mostly focused on carefully reading the Bible, but then over time, his teachings became more extreme. Paul had started being accused of brainwashing his followers. One of his controversial sermons, he used to talk about how evil education is.
Nikaambia watu education is evil. Okay? Wakasema chukueni Mackenzie mweke gerezani. Nikachukuliwa kweli nikawekwa gerezani. Nikasavu ile gereza ile siku nilisavu. Nikatoka. But today I remind all people in the world, have they seen that prophecy that education is evil?
He also used to warn his followers against using mobile money and wearing wigs, and he used to say that these were demonic acts. His controversial sermons had actually gotten him in trouble with the law. In 2017, the pastor and his wife, they were accused of promoting radicalization, and they pleaded not guilty and they were let go. He was also charged in 2019 for disobeying the law, where they said that he would indoctrinate children and he would religiously incite people. And he has also once been detained for opposing the government's efforts to assign national identification numbers for Kenyans because he used to say that the numbers were satanic. So after some of the issues he had with the law and the legal troubles he had, Paul got silent for a while, and this is when he started searching for a new home for his church. He wanted somewhere sacred. He wanted a huge piece of land, a place where people would go and this would be their sanctuary. He said in a sermon in 2020, he once said that the wrath is so strong on this earth, we don't have much time. And he had been telling his followers that the world would end and that this forest would provide a sanctuary for them. And yeah, many people were excited to go with Mackenzie. And you have to remember that this was a time where people were struggling a lot, especially due to COVID, who are struggling financially. And Mackenzie talked about leaving your troubles and difficulties behind and turning to salvation. So we saw a lot of devout followers. They would move there and build homes and worship every day. So what they did is hundreds of people they sold their possessions and the money was donated to the church. And yeah, so they sold their things and they went to Shakahola. And those who went there, they lived in this mud walled structure in small villages. And the villages were given the biblical names. So let's talk about Salema Masha. And she was one of the hundreds of followers of people who went to Shakahola. This is another witness, another mother who escaped Shakahola. And she says that at first she did follow the instructions because, they were told you fast, you get into heaven. But after 7 days of fasting, this is when she decided to stop. And Salema at one point remembers attending a funeral where 8 children had died. And instead of calling it, what it was, these children had been murdered by being starved to death. They used to call it going to sleep. And apparently, the children were the first to go. Then those who are not married, the young, the youth. Then the women. Then the men. And lastly, the church leaders. She says that when the child cries and asks for food or water, we were told to take a cane and beat them up so that they could go and eat in heaven. And she thought about the situation and she decided she did not want to go on with it. She says that I can't eat while my child is starving. I told myself, if I feel this bad when I starve, how about my child? People who questioned the fasting so that you could go to heaven were told that the gates would be closed, the heaven gates would be closed because heaven would be so full. So this is your time, do it now. So Salema, she moved there with actually her husband and her children. Salema discovered from a friend that her husband, who was actually one of Paul's deputies, was heavily involved in burying the dead. And she says that her husband started forcing his family to fast. And Salema waited for her chance. And when he left for work 4 days later, she took her 5 children and she left. And the fact that her husband was one of Paul's deputies protected her. Some members still tried to convince her to stay, but she did not listen and she still left. And after walking for several kilometers, she got a ride to a safe place. Salema says that after a week after she left, some of Mackenzie's deputies did find her and try to convince her to go back, but luckily for her, they did not threaten her. She, however, acknowledges that not everyone was as lucky as her. Salema recalls a woman, this is after Salema had already left Shakahola, a woman came to her asking for help. She had left her children in Shakahola, and the woman was to go back, get her children, but she needed help with money so that she could be able to travel back to her home village. Salema told her that she was willing to help, so the woman went back to the forest to get her children, and no one heard from her ever again. A miner told the court that he witnessed 3 of his siblings die one after the other, with the parents trying to convince them that this was the only way they could meet God. He says that they were taken to the forest by their father, and the mother joined them later. And the mother even gave birth to a child in the forest. He had some special clothes to prepare him for death, and this was as instructed by Paul Mackenzie. And the clothes were a white pair of trousers and a blue polo shirt. He said that his father instructed him to wear the clothes and informed him that they were meant for his death, and then they were deprived of food for 8 days. He remembers seeing people gather in the forest, but he cannot remember the content of the speeches. And he says that Mackenzie used to tell people to fast, and for that reason, these children were denied food by their parents. And he remembers his father taking away his siblings after they had died from starvation. He was rescued by his grandfather and the police and taken to a rescue center. Isa Ali, we'll call him Isa, remembers his mother taking all of her belongings and leaving her family behind. She went to join Paul Mackenzie in Shakahola. And when Isa saw his mother 2 years later, he says she was unrecognizable. She told them that this was probably the last time they would see her alive because earthly life had lost all meaning and she would be going to heaven soon. They tried to stop her and tell her not to go back, but they couldn't. And Isa says that she was not herself at all. And the next time he heard about his mother, his friends had told him that she had been found in one of the shallow graves in the forest. Stephen Whitty has not stopped looking for his wife and children. His wife Joanne has been a dedicated follower of Paul since 2015, and she left while she was pregnant and took their 5 children to Shakahola. Stephen does not believe that any of them is still alive, including the newborn she gave birth to in the forest. He had desperately tried to rescue his children, but he learned from other kids who had been rescued that his children had died. And he believes them because the children can identify his children from pictures. And he learned that his wife and children had died in Jerusalem. This is one of the villages in Shakahola. And he also learned that when his son was killed, instead of the cult members grieving, they clapped and rejoiced and said that he had ascended and had met Jesus. And he also learned that his infant son had only breastfed once before he had been suffocated to death. He even says that he died when he learned that they had died. Joseph Katana suffered from a mental illness since he was a child, and he would have these manic episodes that his parents could not contain. And he says that Paul had saved him from madness. He says that his parents took him to church when he was 24, and this is where he had lived for 2 years. While he lived in church, he says that he used to be tied on a mattress so that he could not escape and he would only be released to eat some food. And in the next 3-4 months, he says that he was feeling free and it seemed like the prayers were actually working. And he was told that if he went back home, he would get sick again. So it was best for him to stay in church and serve God all his life. So he worked at the church as a watchman and he started renting an apartment from Mackenzie for the next several years. When the time to move to Shakahola came, Joseph did not go because he had a part-time job as a tour guide, but his wife Elizabeth and their 5 children went. Elizabeth had witnessed some of Mackenzie's miracles and she was a member of the church. She says that she did try to fast at first, but she was nursing a baby, so she would sneak in some food and some water from the streams where animals drank. Elizabeth saw how severe the fast was. She says that Paul and the security team, they would show up at dying members' houses and they would strangle them and send them to heaven. As for the children, the mothers and the aunts would strangle them instead. And Elizabeth and other witnesses have said that they were made to watch alongside Paul, and she says she felt hurt and powerless. When Joseph went to visit his family, what he saw caused him so much distress. He saw a woman die of HIV because she had stopped taking her medicine. The children were so sickly, they had all these ringworms and fevers, and people were dying all over. He says as they were living with his wife and children, he tried to convince some members to live with them, but they had been so brainwashed and they believed this was really the only way they could meet Jesus. For stories like this, we often hear of members who are living way much more better lives than the other members. And one such member is called Lucky. And he was in the security team and he joined the church in 2018. So he came to learn earlier on that Paul's miracles were fake, but he stuck around because he was making money from the church by doing some odd jobs. And he would also get paid to recruit more members. So when he got to Shakahola, he saw that while others were living in very difficult conditions, the security team lived like kings. Him and his family were not expected to fast. He actually received sacks of maize and monetary payment. He says he used to patrol the village with a machete so that nobody would escape. And he says that he saw people strangled and he also saw men assault women, but he says he did not participate because he had a wife. He says he has never killed anybody. He says, what I regret so much is there is a day some women were running away and they had already escaped, but we took them back. We never saw them again. So Lucky says that he took his orders from a man called Mwakalama, and he says Mwakalama was absolutely brutal. And he was also one of the guys who would select who would get strangled next. Mwakalama had told Lucky that Lucky would have to sacrifice one of his child, and this is why he decided to run away. And they pretended that they were attending a wedding, left, and never came back. Another person who received privileges while they were in Shakahola is Unity. Unity was also part of the security team, and he says that the 2 years he was there, he actually was paid well, he lived well, and he ate very well. And says that if you recruited people to come join the cult, the community, the cult, whatever you want to call it, that you would also get a bonus. And he says that the security would also get bonuses if they took part in the killings. He says if you strangled anybody in that church to death, you were given money. That was like a sacrifice to Mackenzie. He says he wanted to leave, but says that the security were also being monitored by some of Paul's loyal deputies. He says that if you went against his will or his law, we'd also be killed. He says he is glad he didn't kill anybody, but this is after he says that he does not want to think about the role he played in the killings because it is so painful. There is a witness who gave a testimony in court. His identity is being protected, and he says he was forced to deprive his daughter of food and water. He says he tried to protect her, but he gave in to the pressure from the people who are monitoring the fast. His daughter died after 15 days. She was only 1.5 years old. The witness's wife had died after starving for 10 days. According to the witness, many children died between January and February 2023 after a mandatory fasting period was declared by Paul Mackenzie. And the witness also noted that Paul personally saw to the burial of the children who died from starvation. He gave details of how Paul Mackenzie's teachings led to over 400 people dying in Shakahola forest. At this point, police and families were searching for their loved ones, and there was an order in Shakahola for the fasting members to move deep into the forest to avoid detection. After his wife died, the witness spent the rest of his time there, digging graves and transporting bodies to burial sites. So, what led to Paul Mackenzie's arrest? While all this is going on in Shakahola, there are families out there who are looking for their loved ones, right? And there were these two parents who came to the police and told the police that under Paul's instructions, they had starved and they had strangled their own children to death on March 16th and March 17th. So Paul was actually arrested, but he was released on a 10,000 shillings, Kenya shillings police bond. So he retreated back to Shakahola, and the deaths continued there. So some of his collaborators worked really hard to ensure that Paul remained hidden, and there are those who never left his side. There's this incident that happened where 10 people were out shopping for food for Paul Mackenzie and his associates. So these 10 people were attacked, severely injured for being followers of the cult. So the police kept on investigating and collecting more details on the activities going on in Shakahola, and they learned that four more people had died from starvation while 10 others had been rescued. And they were able to trace Mackenzie, and they found him in his hideout. And they looked around the area around his homestead, and they found five children buried there. So this is when all the activities of finding bodies in these mass graves began. And people were stopped from visiting the crime scene, and a curfew was set in the area between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. Shukran Larissa, we'll call him Shukran, was tasked with digging up the bodies in the shallow graves, and he always showed up drunk. But even alcohol couldn't help numb the pain when he found one of his close friends twisted, that his head and torso faced opposite directions. He says that the images of the dead bodies and the images of the dead friend will continue to haunt him to this day. The prosecution had 422 witnesses lined up to testify against Mackenzie and 94 others in the manslaughter case. So Mackenzie's brother Robert says that he took all his children to school, his wife gave birth in hospital, he only adopted the messages that were important for him and his family. He says, I don't agree with the accusations. I know my brother well. There is no way he could kill and bury a person. He says Paul was going to settle down to farm in Shakahola, not kill people and bury them. Paul Mackenzie's firstborn son also came out to defend his father, and he said that his father was moving to Shakahola to farm, not start a cult. He says, my father loves me. When he left us, he told me that if I ever needed anything, he would provide for us. He would often send us maize and tomatoes from there. On his father brainwashing and radicalizing his followers, the son says, all that is a lie because he did not go there with his congregants. He went there on his own because he wanted to become a farmer. Mackenzie has pleaded not guilty to all the accusations. He has pleaded not guilty to murdering 191 children, not guilty to all the counts of manslaughter, among other crimes. He could spend life in prison if found guilty. He has, however, a 1-year sentence separate from the murder for operating a film studio and producing movies without a valid license. He has said that he has no idea what the accusations against him are based on. He says, I have never seen anybody starving or killing themselves or his children. It is just a matter of intimidation and wasting of others' time for nothing. The government of Kenya says that they have set up a commission to investigate the deaths and to review regulations governing religious bodies. There are some survivors who have challenged the state by saying, yeah, we did what we did, but how can you prove that the children are not in heaven? There were also some, after being rescued and taken to hospital, who refused to eat anything. The police did charge some of them for, they refused to eat. They wanted to die from starvation, and the police charged them with attempting suicide. And that is the story of Shakahola. Thank you so much for watching. If there's someone watching, I don't think someone is, but if someone happened to come across my video, thank you so much for being here. I'm Naomi. Hi. I'd really appreciate your opinion.